Thank you, Jennifer. That was very inspiring, and yet one of many reasons I'm really proud to be here and part of this event today, and proud to be part of the tradition that the Teagle Foundation has established over the last 75 years. As Judith mentioned, I spend my time now working in a much smaller institution than Jennifer's, a small English-speaking liberal arts college nestled within a large Palestinian university on the West Bank. And I want to start with a small anecdote from that college, but one, though our college is distinct in many ways and has some distinctive features, I think will still resonate as familiar from classrooms in the United States and other places. Last spring, I taught a class called Human Rights and Global Politics. And in the context of that class, we were discussing the transition to democracy in various places around the world, and we were talking about South Africa. And always my students, who are all Palestinian students, are interested in bringing things back to Palestine. But as soon as we started talking about South Africa, one student, you'll recognize the type, immediately started launching in and saying, why do we really have to talk about what's happening, what happened in South Africa? Palestine is unique. We don't really have very much to learn from this other situation. What's the point of studying that here? About 30 minutes later in the conversation, the topic had slightly shifted, and we were talking about issues of corruption in politics and the ways in which it filters into different places. And there was talk about corruption within the Palestinian political environment. Sure enough, the same student pipes up, and he says, why are we really even discussing this issue? After all, he said, corruption's everywhere. Palestine's just like every place else in the world. What's there to discuss about this? Well, as I said, this was in my classroom in the West Bank, but I think you'll recognize this, that so many of our students kind of begin their thinking about the world in which they're a part, either by thinking of their own situations as unique. There's nothing else like who we are and what we face, or they think about themselves as everything is universal, everything's kind of the same every place. Mm-hmm. And often it's the same people with the same simultaneous point of view held simultaneously, even as you see within the space of a 90-minute class. Okay, it's our job as educators to challenge that, to begin to bring them to a new place. But I think we recognize now, especially seeing this moment, that this is really hard to do, right? The notion of our societies as unique or our problems and defects as somehow universal penetrate, continue, and become absorbed into our larger national consciousness and politics. And it's the notion that somehow we are unique or we're just like everybody else that easily kind of can lead to issues of polarization, deep and paralyzing cynicism, nationalism, and other forces that are contributing to, in some ways, the deterioration of public life in this country and other places around the world. So the question is, how do we challenge those kinds of oversimplifications? And I know that many people in this room are already engaged in this in different ways. But I've come to believe over the last 10 years that one important way of challenging that is that there really is no substitute for a robust commitment to putting one's own civic experience in comparative context, both comparative within the country in which you're a part and also in comparison to other places in the world. And while we often pay a lot of lip service to that, actually enacting that kind of comparative context is maybe done sometimes more rhetorically than practically. And so I want to talk about ways and approaches of helping our young people understand that civic practice, building democracy, building societies, involves choices. and involves choices that can be taken very differently in very different places, not just in terms of outcomes, but in terms of the very structures and values of a society. And I would say that we can do this in three ways. One, to make a kind of deep commitment to comparative context within the classroom, within our curricula. Secondly, and maybe a bit more controversially, but I think you'll see what I mean in a minute and grows out of the context that I'm in now, but is also, I think, part of the larger context of which we're all a part. I think we need to rethink the notion of citizenship as the basis of civic education in a time in which citizenship is a much more fragile kind of relationship than it may have been in the past. And finally, I want to argue for the maintenance and the building of active networks for kind of maximum benefit to our students in terms of connecting them with others who are unlike them in other places, both within their country and in other parts of the world. About 10 years ago, I was working at Brandeis University, as Judith mentioned, running a center that was focused at the time on international issues, international justice, conflict in divided societies. But we really felt that we were missing something important by not thinking about the ways in which our students engage with political, social, and civic life inside the United States. And we thought carefully about how we might stimulate that process with our students in the context of our center. And we decided after a lot of conversation at the time that one way that we wanted to do that was to focus on the states, on the process of creating laws, and enacting policy at the state level. Brandeis is a national institution. Most of its students come from outside of Massachusetts, and one of the things that I remarked on as a resident for a long time of Massachusetts was how little our students actually knew about the state in which they were going to college. I was fortunate in being able to partner with a talented professor of legal studies at Brandeis, Melissa Stumell, who helped us build a program that would focus on engaging our students at the state level, following bills, partnering with state legislators, and learning the whole process of how legislation is created from the ground up, and engaging them also in the process of learning how to advocate for specific bills and specific kinds of policies. And Melissa ran that program with great success for a number of years with its Massachusetts focus. But the program really took on when we said, you know, what's happening in Massachusetts is interesting, but what we really have the opportunity to do with this program is to take it in a much more broader context, to think not only about what happens within one state, but also how different legislatures in different states think about this process and go about the process of building laws and creating new policies in those places. And so from a single Massachusetts-based entity, we created a national program called ENACT, finding faculty members in colleges and universities all over the country who also were interested in engaging their students at the state level in the same kinds of work that Melissa had built at Brandeis. We found sociologists and legal scholars and political scientists and historians and created a network of faculty who were engaging their students on a daily basis. And we connected them through an online platform, as well as through publications and conferences, so that our students not only began to understand what happens in their own state, but also began to understand the radical differences between how democracy is constructed state by state in this country, the different ways in which state legislatures go about their work, how much time they spend, how different bills move their way through the legislative process. And so the ENACT program began to introduce students not just to hands-on democracy in one place, but began to expose them to the wide variety of options. We're very grateful to the Teagle Foundation for its support in helping us now be able to bring ENACT from the 29 states where it was to all 50 states in the United States, so that this national network now will have an ongoing, full comparative process for the United States as a whole. And I think what's important there is that we believe that students will benefit not just because states are laboratories of democracy, but because they are very different from one another, and this comparative context will be the key. One thing I've discovered is that when you start building networks, one thing leads quickly to another. 3 years ago, I was working as a Fulbright scholar in the same university in Palestine, where I've now in a permanent position. And again, was thinking about how to engage my students in issues of political engagement in a very different political context. And so we created, in doing that, I wanted them to understand how things worked in a very different kind of environment. Because again, their exposure was only to their own particular time and place. And so there we created a new network, a network that brought together students from 2 different Palestinian universities with 5 of my ENACT colleague universities in the United States, and built a new network that was focused on civic engagement in this comparative and international context. And we connected classrooms of undergraduate students in 2 different places. Again, a variety of different kinds of classes, but all focused on issues of civic engagement in their different societies. And I'll illustrate this briefly by talking about the connection between my class of American Studies students at Al-Quds University and a class full of students at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University taught by Victor Eno. So we had my Palestinian students in conversation with students at a historically Black institution in Florida. And these conversations, which were both live and through a virtual network, produced forms of shock in 2 directions. First of all, the American students were genuinely puzzled and disturbed as they grew to understand that their Palestinian counterparts, their 18 and 19 and 20-year-old counterparts in Palestine, were not citizens of any place. This concept was foreign and difficult for them. Some of them carried IDs from the Palestinian Authority. All right, some of them had, a handful of them had Israeli citizenship, but most really had no citizenship at all. And this notion of how you participate in a society, how you go about thinking about political change in the absence of citizenship was hard for those students to grasp. Similarly, my Palestinian students were genuinely puzzled and disturbed by the fragility of Black lives in Florida. Thinking of their own situation and their own vulnerability to violence on a daily basis, they were moved and surprised by the sense of fragility and life in the shadow of violence that the students in Victor Eno's class expressed so vividly. So that this shock, I think, produced a kind of learning that couldn't happen in any other way, but also produced a kind of inspiration for both sets of students, because the American students were impressed by the extent to which Palestinian students were determined to build their own society, even within the constraints that they lived under. And the Palestinian students similarly were inspired as events at Parkland unfolded during the semester that I was teaching, about the ways in which young people seized the moment to seize the political initiative within Florida. So I raise this in part, again, to suggest that when we think about civic education, the notion of citizenship is a troubled and difficult one, partly because in some places in the world it's not easily shared, but even within our own classrooms, of course, more and more of our students don't necessarily have the benefits and security of citizenship. We used as an intellectual framework for this program the notion of what is a political actor. something brought to us by our sociologist colleague Darcy Vandegrift at Drake University. But there are lots of other frameworks for thinking about this that could engage students in those ways. Finally, I just want to say that as I came to Al-Quds Bard College, I was fortunate, in this case, to inherit an extraordinary network of which Bard College is a part that thinks about these issues of citizenship and civic engagement in an international context. I'm part of a series of 5 campuses that Bard College runs, liberal arts campuses in different parts of the world. And these campuses are all connected by a series of courses on global citizenship, on civic engagement, on freedom of speech, that give our students an opportunity to engage with other students in similar situations. In short, I want to argue for using curricular, comparative curricular initiatives for rethinking the idea of citizenship and for the building of active networks as ways that I think that we can challenge the insularity of our students, and in larger ways, the insularity of our political culture more broadly. The opportunities are there, and I believe that enacting these kinds of changes give us many opportunities to restore young people's faith that we need to put our institutions aright. Thank you.